that is, I think, strikes us as a reasonable and very pragmatic strategy. That being said, some of the ideas are that we should have a more a tilt towards diplomacy, because we're going to be having to rely more and more on others to achieve our ends. Coalition building over unilateralism, listening and persuasion over didactic approaches. Some scholars thought U.S. policy on the peace process was bordering on the dysfunctional, as it seems not to aim to encourage Israeli accommodation to compromises that we thought would be in Israel's own long interest, and also antagonizes the Palestinians and Arab states, whose populations we are going to have increasing influence because of the democratic principle, and on whose population we're going to increasingly have to rely. So with those comments, Kate.
Thank you very much, Alan. Next, Art Hughes is going to present findings relating to the implications of the Arab Spring for Middle East peace negotiations. Ambassador Hughes is former Director General of the Multinational Force and Observers for Israel-Egypt Peacekeeping. Prior, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, as U.S. Ambassador to Yemen, and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Near East and South Asia, in addition to serving in many posts.
Thank you, Kate. Implications for Arab Spring on the possibility of progress in negotiations on Middle East peace. Of course, the prospects weren't very good even before Arab Spring, due, I think, mostly to U.S. missteps, Israeli policies, particularly with the settlements in the West Bank and around East Jerusalem, and the very fact of Hamas being such a significant player on the Palestinian side. Now, for those of you who looked at this paper online before you came, I'm going to cover almost all of that, but I'm going to do it from a little bit different perspective. And maybe it's from my experience at the Department of Defense on a couple of different occasions. But what I'd like to do is start with what are the Israeli perceptions of what's happening in Arab Spring. And I'd like to start with how Israel organizes its national security. It organized based on four legs. The first is a strong military. That's self-evident. Qualitative edge, to which the U.S. is also committed, nuclear capability, and the security relationship and the American commitment to Israel's security, not based on any treaty, but based on political commitments that go clear back to, well, basically, they really grew after the '67 war. Before that, they were not much, actually. So this amounts to a strategic capability and also a strategic deterrence. The second leg is the treaties with Egypt and Jordan. Start with Jordan first. The importance there is to block any infiltration across the land border and to keep things quiet across the way. Egypt is more important because the treaty limits Egyptian military deployments and operations in the Sinai. So it gives Israel strategic depth. And the limitations on Israel's operations and deployments are monitored closely, very intrusively by the MFO, Multinational Force of Observers, and also by American means such as U-2 flights, keeping track of what Egyptians are doing there. So that part of the treaty has been implemented very, very well on both sides, by the Egyptians and by the Israelis. The third leg is regional and worldwide links. Israel built relationships around the world, Europe including on the economic side, a free trade agreement with the EU, one with us, of course, and also very close links with countries such as China, because China is a very good customer of Israeli high-tech, including some American high-tech that got to China by Israel. This is all public domain. And other countries such as Colombia, with which Israel has had a security relationship, selling equipment and also selling expertise on counterterrorism operations. So those, Israel and other countries have built relationships around the world to try to ensure its own, that would contribute to its own well-being. And the fourth leg is local deterrence. And that really boils down to no actions against Israel that would go unpunished. But unpunished, the reaction at a time and place that Israel's choosing so as to maximize casualties and hurt on the other side and minimize them on the Israeli side. Now, and often with disproportionate force to make the point, such as happened with Cast Lead, the operation in Gaza, the Hezbollah war in 2006, and the Second Intifada, which was totally smashed. Now, local deterrence in the Palestinian territories also partially is the separation barrier. To reduce any infiltration into Israel, reduce Israeli casualties, and that, in that regard, it has been extremely effective. On the political front, of course, it hasn't been so effective because of perceptions about what it means, the lands that were taken, and so forth. But on the security side, it's been extremely effective. Now, at the same time, with the separation fence, one of the corollaries of that is that Israel has stepped back and beyond the security cooperation that exists between Israel and Palestine, which is going very, very well. Palestinian trainees by the Americans, by the Europeans, oftentimes in the West Bank, but oftentimes also outside, for example, in Jordan. But also to encourage encouragement is too strong a word, but allow the development of Palestinian institutions and infrastructure, really building the state. You know, that's the policy of Mahmoud Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad. Build these institutions of the state, and that is actually proceeding very, very well. Okay, so those are the four legs. Now look, what has happened since January? Okay, strong military. Nothing really basically has changed there. Israel still has a strong military, the things I mentioned, and the relationship with the U.S. Now one could get into discussion about what is the relationship between military power and political influence. And there, one could discuss a little bit about how the American military power projection, unparalleled, unchallenged, but how does that relate to political influence? And I think the point that was made by Alan is political influence has been reduced somewhat. But there'll be a lot of thinking about that issue for a long time. On treaties, second leg, it's long been clear that in the region there that governments that are responsive to the will of the public would have a somewhat different approach to Israel, mainly because of what is going on in the territories, but also for other reasons as well. So there has been a clear impact on the treaty situation. First on Jordan, not really very much, because the demonstrations in Jordan have been aimed at certain policies and the government, but not so much as the king. And there's clear understanding, too, that Jordan benefits from the treaties because the Waqf is controlled by the Waqf that administers the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount is a Jordanian Waqf, and Jordan appoints the administrators. So that gives the Jordanians a very key role in the administration of the holy sites there, which is important for Jordan itself, but also important for Jordan's position in the Arab and the Islamic world. So Jordan does benefit from that treaty as well. Now, Egypt, a couple points. First, the military understands very clearly that the treaty works in their interest. Works in their interest. It provides stability there. It provides known rules of the road. The MFO is there. The Americans are monitoring as well. They've met their part of the bargain. And Egypt also, the military also knows that they are no match for any kind of a military confrontation with the Israelis. So to have another situation in which they would be embarrassed would be awful for their standing inside of Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world. So they understand that very clearly, and I think the Egyptian military will ensure that the basic parts of the treaty are maintained. Also, a comment about the Brotherhood. The leadership in the Brotherhood are basically middle-class people, professionals, business people. A big group of business people who have been described to me as basically free marketers. These people also understand the importance of calm across the way to Israel